After the collapse of the Third Reich in May 1945, most of the world believed that Nazism had been crushed forever. Adolf Hitler was dead. The Wehrmacht had surrendered unconditionally, and Allied troops occupied the ruins of Germany. But beneath the ashes of the fallen regime, a dark and desperate dream still burned. It was called Werwolf, a secret Nazi resistance movement that sought to wage a guerrilla war against the victors and keep the spirit of National Socialism alive. The idea of Werwolf, literally werewolf, was born in the final desperate phase of the war. By 1944, it was clear even to Hitler and his generals that Germany faced inevitable defeat. The Allies were pushing in from the west, and the Red Army was advancing relentlessly from the east. Faced with encirclement, Heinrich Himmler and the SS began planning for a different kind of fight, an underground war that would continue even after the Reich was gone. Inspired by Soviet partisans, French resistance fighters, and the guerrilla tactics used against German occupiers in Europe, they envisioned a network of saboteurs, assassins, and loyal Nazis who would haunt the occupying forces long after the Third Reich's official end. The organization's structure was meant to be decentralized, with small autonomous cells operating in secrecy. Recruits were trained in sabotage, espionage, and guerrilla warfare in secluded camps deep within German forests. They learned how to make explosives, derail trains, destroy supply depots, and assassinate collaborators. Propaganda promised them the glory of becoming Avengers of Germany, supernatural predators lurking in the night to punish the conquerors. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels played a crucial role in shaping the myth of the werewolf. In the final months of the war, he used radio broadcasts and newspapers to spread stories of brave young fighters striking fear into the hearts of the Allies. The SS even created a radio station called Radio Werwolf, which urged Germans to resist occupation, sabotage enemy infrastructure, and assassinate traitors. These messages aimed to keep the German population loyal and defiant, even as Allied tanks rolled into Berlin. Some werewolf units did emerge in the last weeks of the war. In March 1945, for instance, a werewolf commando assassinated Franz Oppenhoff, the Allied-appointed mayor of Aachen, a brutal reminder that Nazi violence had not ended with the fall of the regime. Sabotage attacks were reported against railway lines, bridges, and supply depots across occupied Germany. Yet these acts were scattered and largely symbolic. The werewolf's greatest weapon was psychological rather than physical. Allied forces, especially the Americans and British, were deeply concerned about the possibility of a sustained guerrilla campaign. US intelligence warned of potential Nazi stay-behind units prepared to launch terrorist attacks, assassinate occupation officials, and even poison water supplies. Military planners feared the occupation of Germany might become a drawn-out, bloody counterinsurgency. But the werewolf reality never matched the Nazi fantasy. Most Germans were exhausted, starving, and eager to survive rather than fight. The devastation of their cities and the moral collapse of the Nazi regime had broken the population's will. Few were willing to risk their lives for a lost cause. Moreover, the rapid Allied occupation, combined with the dismantling of the SS and Gestapo, disrupted any chance of building a large-scale resistance network. Still, remnants of werewolf activity lingered in the months and even years following the surrender. In Soviet-occupied zones, guerrilla groups composed of former SS men and Hitler Youth launched sporadic attacks on Red Army patrols and communist officials. Soviet reports described ambushes, sniper fire, and small-scale bombings, though it is often difficult to distinguish genuine werewolf actions from ordinary banditry or criminal violence. In the American and British zones, the threat was even smaller, but occasional sabotage attempts and killings kept military police on edge. One of the most persistent myths was that werewolf units had prepared vast caches of weapons and explosives across Germany, ready to launch an uprising at any moment. While some hidden stockpiles were indeed discovered, most were poorly organized and quickly seized by occupation forces. Allied intelligence agencies, including the OSS and later the CIA, spent years tracking suspected underground networks, often exaggerating their capabilities. By 1947, most organized werewolf resistance had evaporated. Yet the legend lived on, both in Nazi propaganda and Allied imagination. For former SS officers and die-hard Nazis, the werewolf myth became a rallying point for post-war underground movements. Secret societies like Odessa, the rumored network helping SS fugitives escape to South America, borrowed from the werewolf ethos of loyalty, secrecy, and vengeance. Neo-Nazi groups in the 1950s and beyond also embraced the name werewolf, seeing themselves as the heirs to a lost Reich. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union used the specter of werewolf activity as justification for brutal crackdowns on suspected anti-communist resistance. In occupied Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, Soviet security forces claimed to be fighting Nazi partisans well into the 1950s, often labeling nationalist rebels or dissidents as werewolves to legitimize repression. In reality, most of these groups had little or nothing to do with the original Nazi resistance plans. The psychological impact of the werewolf myth far exceeded its actual military achievements. While the resistance never came close to becoming the German insurgency that Himmler and Goebbels envisioned, the mere idea of Nazi guerrillas lurking in the ruins of the Reich shaped Allied occupation policy. It fueled suspicion, intensified denazification efforts, and justified harsh measures against former SS members and Hitler Youth. The Allies understood that ideology, not just soldiers, had to be defeated, and werewolf symbolized that lingering poison. Today, historians debate whether werewolf was a genuine insurgency or merely a propaganda illusion. Some argue that the organization was too small, too disorganized, and too quickly suppressed to qualify as a true resistance movement. Others contend that its psychological influence, both during and after the war, was significant, demonstrating how even a defeated ideology can inspire fear, paranoia, and violence. Yet, perhaps the most enduring legacy of werewolf is its lesson about fanaticism. Even in total defeat, even with their cities in ruins and their leaders dead, some Nazis refused to surrender. They clung to the delusion that they could fight on, that the Reich could rise again from the shadows. In that sense, the werewolf was more than a military project. It was a final, desperate expression of Nazi ideology, unwilling to die even when the world had moved on. The story of werewolf did not end in the ruins of 1945. Its legacy continued to echo through the decades, shaping Cold War fears, inspiring extremist movements, and influencing modern ideas of asymmetric warfare. For the Allied powers, the experience of facing even a minimal Nazi resistance shaped the way they approached future occupations. American military planners studied werewolf closely during the occupations of Japan, Korea, and later Iraq and Afghanistan, seeing in it a cautionary tale of how a defeated ideology could linger as an insurgency. One of the most remarkable afterlives of werewolf ideology appeared in the chaotic post-war years of the 1940s and 1950s. As Europe was divided between East and West, the fear of underground Nazis remained a powerful political tool. Western intelligence agencies recruited former SS officers and Wehrmacht veterans for anti-communist operations, despite their past involvement in the regime. Ironically, some of those who had once trained as werewolf fighters now found themselves working for the very governments they had sworn to fight, gathering intelligence on Soviet movements, or aiding in clandestine missions behind the Iron Curtain. In the Soviet bloc, the werewolf myth became a convenient weapon in the hands of communist propaganda. The KGB and its satellite agencies often described anti-communist partisans, such as the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, or the Polish Cursed Soldiers, as fascist werewolves, blurring the line between genuine Nazi remnants and nationalist resistance. This framing allowed Soviet authorities to justify harsh counterinsurgency measures and mass arrests, portraying all dissent as a continuation of the Nazi threat. Even decades after the last werewolf cell had been dismantled, the image of the Nazi guerrilla lurking in the shadows retained a strange power. In West Germany during the 1960s and 1970s, neo-Nazi groups invoked the werewolf legacy in their literature and propaganda. Some militant factions even adopted the name Werewolf Commando, seeking to cast themselves as heirs to the Third Reich's last warriors. Most of these groups were small, fragmented, and quickly suppressed by West German police. But their symbolism reflected the enduring fascination with the myth of the Nazi underground. The term werewolf also began to evolve beyond its original historical context. It became a metaphor for resistance movements that refused to accept defeat, whether driven by ideology, nationalism, or religion. Analysts studying guerrilla warfare often drew parallels between the werewolf's plans and later insurgencies, from the Viet Cong's underground networks in the 1960s to jihadist cells in the early 21st century. While the Nazis had failed to build a true insurgency, their attempt revealed the potential power and limitations of irregular warfare in a modern industrial state. Some historians have speculated that the failure of Werwolf was not inevitable, but the result of Nazi leadership's incompetence and ideological rigidity. The SS focused more on propaganda and symbolism than on practical organization. They lacked the patience and local support that successful insurgencies require. And perhaps most importantly, they underestimated how thoroughly the German population had turned away from the Nazi cause by 1945. Ordinary Germans were not willing to sacrifice what little they had left for a regime that had brought them nothing but ruin. Yet even as a failure, Werwolf left a scar. It taught the Allies that victory on the battlefield does not automatically mean peace. It reminded the world that ideology can survive the collapse of armies and governments, and it served as a dark example of how fanaticism, when cornered, can mutate into terror. The mythology surrounding Werwolf also found its way into post-war culture. Films, novels, and documentaries portrayed Nazi guerrillas haunting the forests of Germany, or plotting revenge from secret bunkers. Some were sensationalist fantasies, portraying werewolf fighters as ghostly assassins or occult warriors, a reflection of society's lingering fascination with the Nazi regime's darker aspects. Others, more serious in tone, used the werewolf story to explore the psychology of defeat and the persistence of extremist belief. By the late 20th century, werewolf had become a symbol of the last gasp, a metaphor for any movement unwilling to accept its own end. Even within far-right circles, the term acquired a romantic, almost mythic aura. Pamphlets circulated among neo-Nazi groups glorified the werewolf as heroic martyrs betrayed by their people, urging a new generation to continue the fight. Such narratives distorted history, turning what had largely been a failed and chaotic campaign into a legend of defiance. In reality, Werwolf achieved almost nothing militarily. Its assassinations and sabotage were sporadic and often ineffective. Most of its leaders were captured or killed within months of the war's end, and the vast majority of Germans ignored its calls to resist, choosing instead to rebuild their shattered lives. But myths are not measured by their successes. They are measured by their power to endure. And on that front, Werwolf has proven remarkably resilient. Modern historians view Werwolf as an early case study in what we now call insurgency without mass support. It illustrates the limitations of terror as a strategy when a population is unwilling to sustain it. It shows how ideology alone cannot fuel resistance if the material and psychological conditions are absent. And it underscores the importance of legitimacy, a lesson that would echo in countless conflicts throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The werewolf legacy also carries a warning for the present. In an era where extremist movements again seek to exploit chaos and resentment. The story of Nazi guerrillas reminds us that even a defeated ideology can persist in hidden corners, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. It shows how myths, even those born from failure, can inspire future generations of extremists, and it demonstrates the necessity of addressing the root causes of fanaticism, rather than assuming that it dies with the fall of a regime. In the end, Werwolf was both a failure and a prophecy. It failed to achieve its immediate goals. The Nazi resistance never rose to challenge Allied occupation, never destabilized the New Order, and never revived the Third Reich. But it prophesied a new kind of conflict, one that would dominate the coming decades. Shadow wars fought not by armies, but by cells and ideologues, waged not on battlefields, but in alleys, forests, and mines. The ghosts of Werwolf still linger in the ruins of the Reich. They whisper of vengeance and defiance, of a cause too poisonous to die cleanly, and they serve as a grim reminder that the end of a war is not always the end of the struggle, that sometimes, even after surrender, the fight continues in the shadows. The story of Werwolf is thus not just a historical curiosity. It is a mirror held up to the darker side of human nature, our capacity for fanaticism, our hunger for revenge, and our refusal to accept defeat. And as long as those impulses exist, the spirit of the werewolves, desperate, delusional, and defiant, will never truly vanish.